Well, welcome to our church history class. The very first lecture is naturally going to ask the question, what is history? We can't very well study a subject if we don't know what we are studying. So the first question that we're going to ask ourselves then is, what is history? When we think about history, we can first of all answer the question very simply. History is simply what happened. If you are playing a soccer game and you shatter a window, you can be sure that your parent or the owner of the house is going to want to know what happened. And he's simply asking you for the history, for an account of what happened, such that his window is now laying in pieces. So what happened, whether we're talking about World War II or the high school going away for a team building effort at some kind of camp, as we can see here, or whether it's a family picture. This is my last family picture before I took the call and moved to Kalamazoo. So there's a ton of history behind that picture, which you wouldn't know about, but which I certainly know a great deal about. And it brings back all kinds of memories in my mind. Well, this is history. History is what happened. In fact, I can remember what happened exactly when we took that picture. I know why some of my children are smiling a little extra hard and what's going on there. And so there's history buried in that picture. There's history, that picture is heavy with history, if I can put it that way. So, but history is not simply what happened. And now I'm thinking more in terms of when you read a history book, when you read a book of history, or when you tell a story about history, that history has two parts to it. History, when we tell it, is not just what happened, but also the interpretation that we place on those events. So, for instance, you can take any particular event and ask yourself, what interpretation do you, as the historian, place on the event or the events? You can ask yourself, was it a positive or a negative event? Was it something that you valued or something that you did not value? Something that you thought was important or unimportant? And of course, the greatest and best illustration I can give you of this is that during the time of the Roman Empire, there were many people who were crucified. Slaves were crucified. Now, of course, it was illegal to crucify any Roman citizen, but still, there were many people, many criminals who were crucified in those years. There was one man, however, who was crucified in Judea on a hill called Calvary just outside Jerusalem. Now, there were actually 3 men crucified that day, but it was the crucifixion of the one man that we continue to talk about today, and that we continue to regard as one of the most important events that ever occurred in world history. So when we ask ourselves, what happened? Well, in terms just of what happened, it wasn't that significant. Another man was crucified in the Roman Empire. It happened probably every day. But as soon as you add in that second part of history, our interpretation that we place upon that event, now suddenly the crucifixion of that particular man becomes of infinite importance for the Christian people. It's the event that defines all other events. It is the greatest of all events. And so that is the crucifixion, of course, of Jesus Christ, which lies at the very center of the Christian religion, at the very center of our hope as Christian people. But I hope you see how many people were crucified. In terms of what happened, it wasn't all that significant. But as soon as we realize that history includes both what happened and our interpretation of that event, now you can see that when we relate the story of the crucifixion of Christ, when we tell that history, we understand that event to have been one of the greatest events that ever took place in the history of the world. But we can take other events in history. Think of our own history as United States citizens. We talk about the Revolutionary War. Here we have the battle, probably the most important battle of the Revolutionary War. This is Cornwallis surrendering his British troops at the city of Yorktown after that battle was successfully won by George Washington. Now, this is an event that is going to be interpreted in a very large, different, in a very, very different kind of way, depending on the interpretation that you put on the event. Now, the event itself is rather straightforward. I don't think there'd be a whole lot of disagreement as to exactly what happened. But the interpretation we place on that event is of great, makes this event going to be told, or this story is going to be told very differently depending on who's telling the story. So, for instance, who might interpret this story as a rebellion? clearly the British people. If you had a British historian and he was describing this event, he would describe it as a rebellion. A war for independence. I think actually both sides would say it was a war for independence, but typically we hear that label more from the side of the people who were in favor of the 13 colonies. Then you have people who want to say it's a liberation from oppression and injustice. Of course, this is clearly a American interpretation of the Revolutionary War, a liberation from oppression, especially oppressive taxation and government regulations on trade and business that the British were placing on American merchantmen. A great deal of injustice, or at least that's our interpretation of it. I suppose, again, you'd get a different interpretation if you asked somebody who was pro-British, one of the Tories at the time. Was the Revolutionary War a civil war? Again, depending on whether you believe the 13 colonies were thoroughly English, in which case then it was a civil war, or whether you believe they had their own national identity, and then, of course, it wasn't a civil war. So again, even these terms tell us and give us a clue for what interpretation is placed on the same event. In our own nation's history, the Civil War. And here, again, you have people who will call it the War of Northern Aggression. Again, a very Southern interpretation. The war to liberate the slaves, much more of a Northern interpretation of the Civil War. A war to protect states' rights. That's, again, a very pro-Confederate interpretation of the Civil War. So there's the Civil War. The event is the same. If I ask what happened, I don't think there'd be too much disagreement on which battles were fought, who the generals were, how many people died in each battle, the terrible destruction and heartbreak that took place in these awful battles that took place in the Civil War. But suppose that this man wrote a history of the Civil War. How would it differ from the history of if this man told the same story? Clearly, again, you can recognize that these men would have different interpretations of what took place in those terrible, terrible years in U.S. history. So what is history? We said that it's what happened plus our interpretation of those events, and that equals history, especially history as we tell it, as we write about it, or as we even explain verbally. When you get home from school and your mother says, "What happened at school today?" You're going to tell not just what happened, but you're also going to have an interpretation of what happened. Now, the question is often asked, is it possible to have a perfectly unbiased account of any historical event or events? So take that illustration I just gave you. You get home from school and your mother, your father, brother, sister says, "What happened at school today?" And you can tell about how you were disciplined by a teacher for some choice that you made that evidently fell afoul of the rules. And so you were disciplined. Now, as you tell that story, you're going to explain what happened, but you're also going to give an interpretation of that event or that series of events. And the question now is it possible for anyone to give an account of history where they only tell what happened? They give a strictly factual description of the events that happened without any kind of interpretation placed on those events. And here, of course, I'm going to tell you that that is impossible. Because as long as we are human, and as long as we have our own mind and our own worldview with our own values, with our own experiences that we've had and how that colors our interpretation of these events, we are obviously going to explain things differently depending on our situation, or depending on our understanding of our interpretation of those events. So when you get home from school and explain how you were disciplined, if you think you were unfairly disciplined, that is going to mean that you are going to explain or tell that story, that you're going to explain those events differently than if you believe you were justly or fairly disciplined. In the same way, if you lost a basketball game or if you won a basketball game, if you ask those who lost the basketball game and tell them, "Now give me just the facts, just tell me exactly what happened." Well, it's impossible for a human to explain just what happened without a little bit of his own or her own interpretation sneaking into that explanation. It might even be nonverbal. If you lost the game, you might scowl as you explain what happened. Or if you won the game, you might pump your fist in the air or something like that. But at any rate, something of how you interpret or how you understand those events would work its way into your explanation of what happened, be it in a basketball game or whatever it may be. So history then is what happened plus our interpretation of those events, and that is what we mean by history. And that's what we're going to study in this class. And of course, that means that even as I present to you the history of the church, as I hope to do in this class, it's going to come from my interpretation. I can't possibly give you an interpretation of history or an explanation of what happened in history without my interpretation coming through. And you're of course you're going to hear that. And it's good that we be honest about that right up front and recognize that my teaching of history is going to come with my own particular interpretation and perspective on those events. Just as every time you tell a story, your own particular perspective is going to be involved in the explanation of those events. So that's what we're going to expect this semester then, an explanation of what happened, but also an interpretation of those events. And those two things together will give us history.